All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our virtual hilltop. We're really pleased to welcome you today to our first ever Hoyas Helping Hoyas in Government Relations sessions. My name is Beth Schill, and I'm a career advisor at the Colley Career Education Center. I specialize in helping advise students who are interested in jobs in government, nonprofit, and education sectors, and that includes the wide world that is government relations. So we are really excited for our panel that we have with you today. We have 6 alums actually with us today. Even our moderator is an alum, and they work in a variety of organizations that you'll hear from that kind of represent, I think, the breadth of the world that is government relations. A couple housekeeping items. If you have any issues, feel free to use the text function, the chat function, to send me a message. And when we get to Q&A, we'll use that as well to kind of tee up the questions. But in the meantime, if we wanted to go ahead with our panelists and have them introduce each other, and we'll go ahead and start with Lindsay Morris.
Great.
Lindsay.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Morris. I'm with Bayer currently. I graduated from Georgetown in 2000 with a degree in economics and a minor in Italian. I haven't used as much of the Italian as I would like to in my current job. Then I also got my master's in public policy in 2004. That was during the time that I was also working on the Hill. So right after college, after I graduated, I moved home to Ohio for a year. During that time, it was a little interesting blip there, but did a year of law school. I did not love law school. I came back to DC to work for my home state senator, who was at that point the chairman of the antitrust subcommittee in the Senate, as a law clerk for him. He sympathized with my desire not to return to law school and offered me a job, which I then held for about 5.5 years. I initially started on judiciary issues. I then moved to, as you do when you work on Capitol Hill, moved over to many other issues. And ended up on healthcare. I then worked for another senator from Oregon on healthcare issues before he was not reelected. From there, I worked with a number of trade associations related to healthcare issues, one related to medical devices, and then another on consumer health products, so over-the-counter medicines. Worked for those trade associations for about 8 years in total, and then about 4 years ago started working for Bayer. Bayer is a large company. We, as folks may know, we have Bayer aspirin. We also have lots of other crop science products, so we do a lot of work with farmers. We also have a pharmaceutical business working with oncology products and hematology products and women's healthcare products. So I don't work on all of those issues directly, but we have a team, and I'm part of that team, and work really closely with our consumer health business, really, which is sort of our nutritionals and our over-the-counter medications and policies related to those. So that's what I do really in a lot of my day-to-day. I know you also wanted to sort of have us touch a little bit on what we learned at Georgetown, and how that's really impacted where we went in our career. I can't tell you how much, I can't emphasize enough how much Georgetown impacted my career, from really being here in DC, which gave me so many opportunities to have internships, to network, to also, on campus, I was a manager at Vital Vittles. So, getting some of those leadership qualities as well there. And having a lot of fun, and making friends. Those were, really things that have carried through in my career as well. I think when I came back to get my master's as well at the School of Public Policy, they were so good there at helping us better network and connect with the professors that we had there that are so ingrained in DC and policy, that it was it really, they helped us and they really encouraged us to use them as stepping stones. So, so there, yeah, I don't think there's a way that Georgetown probably hasn't influenced my career. So, yay.
Great, thank you, Jenny. Or Lindsay, sorry. I'm looking
No worries.
ahead to Jenny, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name's Jenny Smallson. I am a proud Hoya, class of 89, which is really, makes me really old. But I was a French major with a minor in international affairs. And my career path is strange, and I wouldn't have it any other way. So after graduating from Georgetown, I took some time and I lived abroad to work on my French skills, and that was awesome. And I came back to Washington, D.C., where I was from, and I immediately started looking at all opportunities that might be out there. And I found myself, my first job I took was working for a congressional caucus, and that's back in the way days when they had staff. And I worked for the Congressional Arts Caucus, where we tracked and monitored federal arts legislation and advocated for funding for the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities. And after my stint there, when those caucuses were dissolved, when the Republicans took over the House Scott Fleming probably knows the year, I don't remember, I moved over to the United States Senate, where I worked for the chairman of the Education, Arts, and Humanities Subcommittee, again, working on those portfolios that focused on the arts and humanities. That was Senator Jim Jeffords from Vermont, who was a moderate Republican, and the chairman of that subcommittee. And after another senator retired, we moved to take over the full committee, and Senator loved the issues of those subcommittees, so he elevated all those issues to the full committee. So I became a full committee staff person on the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and I took over some of the education issues as well, working on higher education. And during that time, I was really lucky to work with people like Scott Fleming and Lindsay Morris. So this is awesome for me. And Kim was one of my dear friends while I was in college, and Winnie's one of my dear friends now. So like, it's awesome. So that's what Hoyas helping Hoyas. It extends beyond your workplace and into your heart and in your life. So that time on the Hill was incredibly instructive and amazing and meaningful to me. But time went on, and it was time to change paths again, and I went to work for the American Psychological Association. And so at that nonprofit, again, my focus was on education issues, and of course, mental health issues in that education space. So again, working with people like Lindsay and her old boss on programs that supported college mental health and a lot of other things. And recently I've taken on a new role, which I'm like giddy excited about, and I work for the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities. So I get to represent Georgetown and the 26 other Jesuit colleges and universities all around the country to advance the mission of strengthening Jesuit education and making sure that students like you and so many others have an opportunity to study at a Jesuit college or university. And we do that through really focusing on student financial aid issues and advocating strongly for the Pell Grant, and the campus-based aid programs like Federal Work Study and SEOG and the Perkins Loan programs and public service loan forgiveness programs and TRIO and all these critical federal programs that really provide access to higher education. So I think every single day I'm grateful for my Georgetown education, and I think there I was encouraged to get excited about learning. And again, I had a weird major and a weird minor that I didn't always apply in my workplace, but I wouldn't have it any other way because it got me excited about learning. And to this day, I learn something new every single day, and every single day in every one of my jobs. I think Georgetown taught me to be all in and be a passionate learner and be excited and be open to learning something all the time. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenny. And thanks for looking out for us up on the hill.
Of course.
All right, Joe, if you want to go ahead.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Beth. Good afternoon, folks. Joe McGowan, class of '02. I had the privilege of attending the college and was a government major in my time at Georgetown. I currently serve as Executive Director of Federal Government Affairs at Novartis, which is a global biopharmaceutical company. Looking back on my time at Georgetown, I really credit it, although I didn't, frankly, at the time, with sort of leading me to my path in government affairs and the policy world. Despite having grown up here in the DC area, much like Jenny, government and government affairs wasn't necessarily something that I was focused on or passionate about at 17 or 18, but as part of my government major, I took a summer course which required an internship of some sort, and not really knowing what it was that entailed, I was able to, thankfully at the time, secure an internship at the American Gaming Association, which represents the commercial casino industry in DC, and I'm not really a gambler and knew nothing about the casino industry, but it did afford me the opportunity to understand at a very entry-level basis how trade associations interface with policymakers and the commercial sector in this case that they represented. And it really opened my eyes to sort of both the policy and the politics world and how those two things came together. Following that summer internship, which I continued a couple days a week during my senior year in between classwork, I shortly after graduating was able to secure a position in the US Senate, where I worked for 4 years, much like folks right out of college, starting out answering the phones in the front office, and then slowly worked my way up, spending the last 2 years on the legislative staff focused on appropriations issues for the senator for whom I worked, which is how I got initially acquainted with Scott when he was in his role at Georgetown and was interested in discussing matters with respect to federal funding primarily. Much like Lindsay, my boss at the time lost re-election. It was a bad time for my case as a Republican to be a Republican in Washington because it was a very bad year. And so sort of trying to figure out what I was going to do next, I was very fortunate through some of the connections I was able to develop working in the Senate to secure a position in the Bush administration at the time at the Department of Health and Human Services. Again, sort of looking back, healthcare was not an issue that I spent much time in. I think if you told me what Medicare was or tried to explain to me, I would have probably put my fingers in my ears at the time. But here I am, 15 years later, focused on healthcare issues exclusively. So I just say that to suggest that, never close a door because you never know where things may end up leading. After my time at HHS in the Secretary's office, I worked at a law firm here in Washington on the consulting practice focused on healthcare issues, which again, sort of similar to both my time on the Hill as well as my time in the college at Georgetown. The great thing about that role is you really get to dive into a whole host of different issues and sort of figure out what it is that you like and maybe don't like, which was sort of one of the great benefits, I think, of being in the college at Georgetown, where they require you to take courses in a whole range of areas. And through my work at the law firm, I decided that the life sciences pharmaceutical space was something that I was really interested in growing and developing my career in. So after a few years in the law firm environment, I then transitioned to another life sciences company, GlaxoSmithKline, where I worked for a number of years before moving over to Novartis. And so I really credit the education and the opportunities that I received at Georgetown, both with being able to secure an internship, but I think more importantly, sort of that broad perspective of not being able, or not being afraid rather of learning and diving into a whole bunch of issues that you may not know anything about, which I think really gives you a broad perspective and sort of helped me land where I am today.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. All right, Winnie, you want to go next?
I am happy to go next. Winnie Stackelberg. I currently work at the Center for American Progress, which is a multi-issue progressive think tank here in Washington. I'm a native New Yorker. I had parents who were very politically active in New York City. And so when I was a senior, end of junior year of high school, senior, looking for colleges, I knew I was going to move back to New York City and probably be mayor of New York or run for Senate or Congress. So I thought it would be best to actually go to school not in New York, because I knew I was going to move back and spend my life there. I looked around for schools that were challenging, that had the intersection of politics and government, and were in a city, because I was from a city and I love that. And I picked Georgetown. And I'm pretty happy I did. I'm a native New Yorker, as I said, Jewish, so I think going to a Jesuit school is not necessarily the sort of obvious choice, but it is a choice that when I look back on now, I don't really know how lucky I was to have selected Georgetown. I graduated in 1986 I went to the college with a double major in government and English, and wrote an interdisciplinary thesis on African-American women's literature. And I think it's a testament to Georgetown that there is such an embrace of opportunities, educational opportunities and other things. Like Lindsay, great to hear. I'm also a Corpie. I worked for Saxa Sundries, not Vital Vittles. I ended up as the general manager of the store. I was on the crew team. And I think I just jumped into Georgetown because of all the opportunities that it afforded me. I have lifelong friends from the school and really appreciate the college. One of the things that was so great about Georgetown, and one of the reasons why I wanted to go, is because of the internship and volunteer opportunities. I can remember driving down 395 to Lorton Prison and tutoring tutoring people in the maximum security prison. I remember going to Sursum Corda and tutoring there. And again, I just think Georgetown gave us so much to choose from and pushed us to be better citizens, better students, and better in our community. I graduated, as I said, in 1986, and I don't know about anyone else of my colleagues here. I had no idea what I was going to do. I had no idea. And I was so jealous of my friends, of other seniors at school who were graduating and going to law school. They were going to med school. They were going to a program on Wall Street. They were going to the Peace Corps. Whatever it was that they were doing, they knew what they were doing, and I didn't. So I moved back to New York City, and I got a job teaching at a public school, teaching English, because I had enough credits from my double major to show the New York Board of Education that I could teach English. So I spent 3 years teaching, 2 years teaching English in New York City at a public high school, George Washington High School, and 191st Street and Audubon Avenue, which was one of the most exceptional experiences I've ever had. And I think in some ways grounds me with government affairs. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about this, but government affairs, public relations, government relations is all about connecting with people. It's about telling stories. It's about selling a product, whether that's LGBT civil rights or whether that's a pharmaceutical or whether it's higher education. It's about selling something. And I think I learned in many respects in the classroom how to communicate and how to sell education in this respect. I taught public school for 2 years, then I moved back down to Washington to get a master's in public policy from George Washington. I got a presidential management internship, it was called then, PMF, and worked for 3 years for the Office of Management and Budget in both the Bush administration and the Clinton administration. I was a career budget examiner, an incredibly awesome way to get a full view of how government works from OMB. I was there for 3 years, and it was just wonderful working on healthcare issues, working in health and income maintenance division. Just to say, and we can talk a little bit more about this later, my then partner, who is now my wife now, said in 1993, well, you know what we should do? We should just quit our jobs and we should travel around the country. And I said, that is about the most unimaginable thing we could do. You don't just like quit a job and not have another job. You don't just leave a career path. And she said, no, that's exactly what we should do. And so we quit our jobs and traveled around the country for 5 months. And I just have to say that I'm so happy I did it then, because, you know, I have 17-year-old twin boys. I could never do it. I have a mortgage. I have all of these responsibilities. And had I not done it when I was 30, I would never have done it. So I just sort of encourage you to take risks. And I think Georgetown provides us all the impetus to do that. When I came back, I had to find a job, and I completely landed. I had no idea I was going to end up doing this. I completely landed as a public advocate in the healthcare space, working at the Human Rights Campaign in 1994. 1994 election figures prominently in the conversations of many of you, and I accepted my job before the 1994 elections, and I started working at the Human Rights Campaign after the 1994 election. So the political climate was slightly different for HIV and AIDS and LGBT issues. I worked at the Human Rights Campaign for 11 years doing government affairs from the inside of an advocacy organization. I left there in 2005 and started at the Center for American Progress, where I am now. And again, I do government affairs, I just want to say that I think I might be unique in the sense that I work in government affairs, but I've never worked on the Hill. And I think that is possible to do. We can talk a little about that. But I manage our government affairs advocacy. So we sell ideas now at the Center for American Progress, from, you know, the Iran nuclear deal to Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal to the Affordable Care Act, ideas that we want to sell to people on Capitol Hill and into state governments around the country.
Thank you, Winnie. Okay, Kim, if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Kimberly, or Kim Mazik. I graduated in 1990, overlapping with my dear friend, Jenny Smallson. As I told her, I told others earlier, I was going to give her a shout out. Jenny Smallson is the reason I passed my French proficiency in the School of Foreign Service, because she was a dear friend who just kept speaking to me in French and really committed. So that's her shout out for the day. So her French degree is real. But so I was in the School of Foreign Service, did an international degree. And when I started, I thought, oh, I'm going to be a diplomat. I'm going to live in Europe. This is what I want to do. And my sophomore seminar, I took a class with Professor Howe. And I can't remember the ambassador's name, but it was such a striking class for me. It really made me think on our feet. All of our exams in that class were also oral exams. But it made me really think about, how do you do an analysis of policy, but how do you also talk about it? So then I shifted. So this is in the 80s. And so this is when lots of people were talking about South Africa and apartheid movement. And at the same time, Jack DeGioia was at that time the Dean of Student Affairs. And he, and along with some others, went down to South Africa to kind of figure out what to do, since there was a big campaign to divest from South Africa as a university. And one of the things that they did is they met with a lot of Catholic leadership and a lot of different political leadership down in South Africa, and thought, what could Georgetown's response be? So they established a teaching program in South Africa. As one thing they heard from a lot of schools in the areas, as schools were going from a medium of instruction in Afrikaans to English, it'd be helpful to have native English speakers come in and help and teach at that time. So armed with my degree from SFS in International Affairs and African Studies, I was in the certificate program. Of course, I knew exactly what I was going to do. So I headed down with a number of volunteers. There were about 13 of us that went in 91, although there had been a number of people who went previous years, and taught at an all-girls school in South Africa, up in what was a homeland in the north, just north of Johannesburg. And it really taught me a lot. And because I had traveled before. My dad was in the military, and I'm a military brat. And so before high school, I'd lived 7th, 8th, 9th, and the beginning of 10th grade in Europe, and traveled a lot and got to see a lot, which is what I think the impetus was to think about Georgetown as a school. But this is where I began to see kind of how policy can have an impact on people's lives. So I spent a year there teaching, and I think that Georgetown, not only by developing the program, but how our academic career is structured in our time there. And I don't think we often think about taking philosophy and religious studies, but I do think it opens up to how other people think, how other people live. And when you're thinking about policy, it's not just your point of view, but how that impacts other people. So when I came back, I was really focused on working on Africa policy related to any part of Africa. And I'd had done an internship during my time at Georgetown at Africare, but I couldn't find a job. I tried every organization that had anything to do with Africa, but I was staying with a friend who worked on the Hill. So one day she asked me to come in and talk to her chief of staff. And next thing I know, I was being offered a job. And like most of you, I started as the LC. So I was like, oh, I'm going to, do the letters and make sure correspondence for our member gets out. He happened to be the member that represented where I went to high school in Florida, a gentleman by the name of Jim Backus. And he brought me on, and, when I eventually got promoted to LA, I was still doing issues that I was like, no, I want to do international. I'm really focused. This is really important. And I still have an annual conversation with him. He calls me once a year, usually right before Christmas or right after, and just to check in and see how I'm doing. But I used to push him like on Haiti and other issues that we didn't necessarily agree on. And then I, through a chance meeting of networking through people I knew at Georgetown and people I knew in my neighborhood that I was living in at the time, Mount Pleasant in DC, was introduced to some people who worked at Human Rights Watch, and was allowed to take some opportunity there, doing a lot of, and the position I was hired into was to help write testimony for things happening on Capitol Hill and the countries we were working on. So this was in the 90s. And so then Rwanda happened. So I was there during the 1994 genocide that happened in Rwanda. I literally had not even been there 6 months before that happened. We started documenting that, and then I was asked to go and spend some time helping document what had happened in the South. And I think that's where the switch for me really changed. Not that policy wasn't important, but what policy was going to make a difference for me and what I was going to work on. There's no way to kind of prepare yourself to talk to people who've experienced a genocide, especially. I don't think there's anyone that's more horrific or less horrific, but when people are used to seeing their whole communities be murdered or killed, it's a very different conversation. And so when I came back, I was like, what do I do with this knowledge? What do I do with my passion to, I was still like, I can change the world. I can make a difference here. And so that's when I kind of drilled down and I'm going to go study theology, which surprised everyone. Everyone thought I would go to law school. They thought I would do something else. And I went out to Berkeley, California, to the Graduate Theological Union and studied with more Jesuits there, and really was able to dialogue with 2 Jesuits and done a lot of work and were interested in the work or what I had seen in Rwanda. And but as this is what I kind of saw in South Africa and Rwanda, is that it's important to do international policy, but I also was always very connected to what the situation was on the ground and grassroots work. So I came back and were to work for a children's literacy organization. I don't think any of this ever, there's no way if I was going to knit this out into a blanket or a scarf, it would be a wholly blanket or scarf and not make any sense, and the colors would be all different. But I was doing a lot of advocacy about how can we help low-income communities around the country get access to the resources that children need to be better readers and to perform better in school. And a lot of that is what access they have to books at home. But also, how do we empower people in communities to speak to those issues? I mean, Wendy talked about selling something, and it's one thing to do it from a national perspective. It's also, important how we educate people at the grassroots level. And that's when I became really like, this is an important element. Not thinking that I wanted to leave, I got a phone call one day. I was in California traveling for work. It was at 6 a.m. and I thought, who was calling me? And somebody said, I got your name. I wanted to talk to you about coming to work for Catholic Relief Services. I hear that you've spent time in Africa, you believe in education, and you have a Catholic background and you know theology. I was like, can I get up and wake up? So I took a job with Catholic Relief Services and again, helped develop our the advocacy program to help people understand better the continent of Africa. So not just all the bad things you hear, but also what people are doing on the ground and how you can really build up a grassroots community. Spent about a fair amount of time there, about 13 years, and then I was recruited to come back and do domestic work. So currently I'm at Catholic Charities USA, so the national organization for the 168 Catholic Charities agencies around the US and in the US territories on the social policy team. And again, doing both, handling a portfolio of issues around, of course, you're not going to be surprised, education, hunger, nutrition, but also trying to build up the capacity of each one of our agencies so they can do that work as well. So it's a both and. And as I try to advocate for issues, whether like I had a meeting with the Senate today, and now I'm going to have a meeting at the end of the week with my agencies in California to say, well, this is what has to happen in the state of California for us to make this work really well in terms of SNAP programs and a waiver for some of the things they want to do, so that people constantly understand there's a lot of work we're trying to do in Washington, but how do we work with the local community to make real things and real change happen?
Awesome, thank you. Thank you all. You all do incredible work. So with that, I would like to also introduce our moderator for the rest of our session, and that's Mr. Scott Fleming, who's also an alum and also spent much of his time here working at Georgetown. So I'll have him introduce himself, and then Scott, if you want to go ahead and move us into the Q&A, that would be fantastic.
Sure, I'll be pretty brief. I graduated in the class of 72, and that's the Stone Age. I came to Georgetown with a manual portable typewriter, so I'm really glad I could get onto Zoom. I think it's pretty. So I graduated in 72, School of Foreign Service, and I thought I wanted to go into the Foreign Service. And I took the Foreign Service exam, passed the written, not the oral. My wife said, I never thought you were the smartest guy, but I thought you could talk your way out of anything, but whatever, it didn't happen. I had interned for my home state senator, a man named Stuart Symington from Missouri. I grew up in Kansas City. 4 semesters during my undergrad years at Georgetown. I loved that internship. And I'd gotten into law school at Georgetown, and then I was like, I applied to law school because all my friends were applying to law school, and I really wasn't sure I wanted to do that. So I asked if there was any chance I could have a job, and luckily there was. I worked for him for 3.5 years, staff assistant, legislative correspondent. That's how a lot of things start on the Hill. Left and went to grad school at the University of Texas in public policy, the LBJ school there. Came back, went to work for a guy named Dan Glickman. He was a congressman, Democratic congressman from Wichita, Kansas. This is the first point in our lives where Jenny Smallson's and my life intersected, because when she was with the Congressional Arts Caucus, the executive director of that Arts Caucus was Rhoda Glickman, wife of Congressman Dan Glickman. So that was the first of several interactions throughout our career. I was with him for almost 12 years and decided it'd be fun to do something different, and ended up being chief of, and I was his LD, and then I was his chief of staff. And I told the guy named Tom King, who did our campaign media, that I thought it'd be fun to work with another freshman. I really got a kick out of that. Most people want to work for very senior members. I enjoyed sort of helping them get up and go. And he introduced me to one of his other clients, a woman named Nita Lowy. She was a congresswoman from Westchester County, New York. She's now the first woman to chair the Appropriations Committee in Congress. This old guy is very proud of that. And we connected, and I was her chief of staff for a little over 7 years. And that election that you asked about, Jenny, was 1994. And I had always, at that point, I'd worked on the Hill for 21 years, all for Democratic members when Democrats were in control. And that election meant they were no longer going to be in control. And so I'm thinking, this is not going to be as much fun as it used to be. Fortunately, I was dealing with people at the Department of Education, New Rochelle, New York, which has been in the news at the very beginning of the coronavirus. That was in Congresswoman Lowy's district, and the school district there had applied for a federal magnet school grant, and they were not selected. But when the Department of Education sent good news or bad, they shared with the applicants the scores that different reviewers had given their applications and how it was added up. And the superintendent of schools called and said, we need your help because the Department of Education messed up their math. And if they had added properly, we would have been funded. Congresswoman Lowy had just gotten on the Appropriations Committee, on the Labor, Health and Human Services Education Appropriations Subcommittee. So I got on the phone with people that I knew in the Congressional Affairs Office at Education and said, you gotta fix this. This is not gonna set well with her. We have 2 press releases, one saying how the department can't add and the other congratulating the secretary and correcting the mistake. Anyway, it got worked out, but it took some time. And in the midst of those conversations, the deputy assistant secretary with whom I was working said she was getting ready to leave, and did I know anybody who might be interested in that opportunity? And I said, what about me? And so I actually was very good friends with the assistant secretary, a woman named Kay Cass Stevens. Some of you would have known her over your careers. And it took a while, but it ended up happening. And I left and I went to the department. I was deputy assistant secretary and then assistant secretary, and stayed until the end of the Clinton administration, and had the really good fortune of going to work back at Georgetown in February of 2001, when I started as the Associate Vice President for Federal Relations, a job I truly loved. And while I was at Georgetown, I had lots of opportunities to pester other people on this Zoom call right now. I'm sure there were times they were tired of that, but they were all very generous. And I think one of the things you take away from it, and talking about being at Georgetown, and one of the things you gain is there is a tremendous network of alums, both working on Capitol Hill and in government relations. I skipped there. After I was deputy assistant secretary, I nominated to be assistant secretary, and Jenny Smallson was involved in moving my nomination through the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. So that's connection two. And then when I was at Georgetown, we saw each other a lot and communicated a lot, as I did with others. And then I retired at the end of 2018 and planned on doing a lot of traveling. We did take a nice trip to the Middle East. We came back, and the woman who had headed federal relations at the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities, and with whom I had worked for my entire time at Georgetown, had passed away unexpectedly. And I was asked if I would step in on an interim basis. And I said, sure, as long as it remained interim, because we had plans. The coronavirus has sort of screwed them up. But anyway, we had plans. And I'm very happy to say, once again, Jenny and Scott crossed again. Here we are. And Jenny was the person we recruited to be the new Vice President for Federal Relations at the AJCU. So that's me in a nutshell. So now I want to open it up for the students who are on the call. Please send through the chat room, send questions to Elizabeth, which will get them to me. And we'll start. I want to populate this as much with your questions as others that we might ask. But while we're giving you a chance to do that, I want to start by saying one of the things I've experienced in my career in both advocacy and on the Hill is there are things that are involved in the work we do that probably if somebody said, you're working in government relations, that wouldn't necessarily register as part of what you do. So I'm hoping some of you can share examples of that with the students on the call. Any volunteers?
Sure.
Joe, there you go.
Sure, happy to jump in. I think, and this is something that our team has been at Novartis has been increasingly pushed to engage in further than I think we have historically, and certainly than I did at my previous place of employment. But that is sort of pulling and tying together the government and the policy piece with the commercial strategy. In our case, for product launches. So really having the opportunity, which is something that I think a lot of folks, and certainly myself included, didn't necessarily appreciate early on in my career, which, and again, it's something somebody without a MBA or even a undergrad business degree doesn't necessarily have the full business/commercial perspective, but we have the government and the policy and the politics perspective to bring to bear on business related discussions and decisions. And so I think being able to bring in the expertise that I'm sure everybody collectively on this call has to areas, whether it's commercial or otherwise, are things that I didn't necessarily understand or appreciate prior. And that's just to say that I think we all have skills and things that are of interest to people internally in our various organizations or companies that we may not fully appreciate or understand because it's something we all live and breathe every day, but they certainly don't in their day-to-day. So that's one piece I might add.
I would just mention the importance of developing relationships and maintaining those relationships over time, and knowing enough about the people that you are engaging with to find a way to connect to them and spark an interest. I'll go back to Lindsay and Senator DeWine. For a number of years when I was at Georgetown, the Center for Intercultural Education and Development at Georgetown sponsored a program called Cooperative Association of States for Scholarships, which was basically a program that was partnering with community colleges around the United States and brought in students from Central America and the Caribbean to study on their campuses. And Georgetown managed that program. And Senator and Mrs. DeWine had a very deep interest in Haiti. And a number of the students who came to the United States were from Haiti. And knowing that, when the program's director from Haiti came to town, we were able to get an appointment with Senator DeWine to have him come in and talk about the program and how it was impacting Haiti. And following that, the senator took a really great interest in that program. I spent a lot of time worrying about maintaining and strengthening relationships with our alumni members of Congress and our alumni staff. But that was one when you found an opportunity to go to someone about something that was not necessarily for an alumni reason, and they did take an interest.
Right. Yeah, and it really is. That is an example, I think, of something that folks may not necessarily think of that you would work on too. You really get these incredible opportunities. DeWine, as you mentioned, his interest and love for Haiti may not be something that you necessarily think that people are involved in on government affairs, but it's something that, you know, this person takes such a deep interest, such a huge need with the HIV population there. It's in our own hemisphere, it's in our own backyard. There's such an incredible need there, and it's something that you know, you really get these really amazing opportunities to be able to make a difference in places that are so important, and yet sometimes it seems so obvious that we would care, and yet they become so overlooked.
So we have a question.
If I could just, can I just
sure,
jump in
Winnie,
on that? Because I think what you all are saying speaks to something that each of us has mentioned in some way in our introductions, which is about connections and audience and knowing your audience. I think it's wherever you sit in government affairs, and the most important thing to do is to understand whom you're talking to, and therefore come up with the best story, the best data, the best arguments, the best examples to get that person to, you know, sign as a co-sponsor on a piece of legislation, give a floor speech, go to a community center, whatever, increase appropriations for SNAP, whatever it happens to be. But it takes, I think one of the things about government affairs that I find the most fascinating is it's not boring in the sense that it is all a reflection of the point you're trying to get across. And so you need to think through who you're trying to influence, because people might, in the Senate, taking Haiti as example, all be committed to support for Haiti, but the arguments that you might use, the data you might provide, the stories you might tell in order to get them to do something might be very, very different. One might be about religion, one might be about saving children, one might be about being a good partner, whatever it happens to be. Knowing your audience is a really important part of government affairs.
Well stated, Winnie. So we have a question from Matt Hershey. His question is, what advice would you have for pivoting from the public sector to the private sector? We could broaden that also. What help would lead one to either come from the private sector into the public sector, or to go from the Hill into the administration? I know, Joe, you talked about moving from the Hill to the Bush administration. So maybe you'd like to touch on this to start?
Sure, happy to. I think kind of going back to the theme that a number of us have touched on, I think keeping, and certainly in my case in healthcare, I think keeping an open mind and not necessarily closing any doors, which I think ties in really well to some of the things that we at Georgetown, you know, going back to sort of the Ignatian values of, you know, open mind approach to learning. I think those are things that I would definitely impart on anybody as they're thinking about making a transition from whether it's public to private, private to public, or what have you. I think keeping an open mind and really not necessarily having a predetermined or set path. I think sometimes in a lot of ways, the most fruitful path is the one that you may not necessarily have sort of thought out and planned out 10 or 20 years ahead of time. At least speaking for myself, it's really been a great opportunity to sort of looking back and not saying this is where I need to be in 10 years or 5 years or even 2 years, sort of, taking things in a lot of ways sort of as they come at you and being certainly thoughtful as you continue or consider rather a career jump. Because on the flip side, I think often you see people who have, maybe an incremental improvement in, say, title or even salary, but they make that jump. And I think you see this, at least from my perspective, in people leaving, say, the public sector, go to the private sector, where you have sort of that incremental jump, but then 5 years from when that jump is made, you're in some ways more difficult to sort of broaden or expand your horizons again. So that's all to say, I think just sort of keep an open mind, think ahead, but don't think too far ahead.
Kim, I think your career certainly reflects that, the kind of movements, I mean, the variety of things you've done, and having had that experience in the Senate and then going forward, maybe you could talk a little about this.
Yeah, and I think as you think about vacillating from one to the other, one of the important things I learned, especially trying to build people's capacity to be advocates, to talk to their members of Congress, is, again, it's helping them understand their story and how to tell the story. One of the things I learned when doing advocacy on Sub-Saharan Africa, when I was working for Catholic Relief Services, I sponsored a lot of trips where we took people over to different countries in Africa. And the point is to get them to experience, but the real important thing is how to help them become a better storyteller. I mean, if you want to share a story, I mean, we talked a lot about Haiti, and, we can see things on the news, but sometimes it still is not tangible for some people, and they really feel like they want to touch it. But how do you take people overseas, give them an experience, or help them introduce them to people? Again, talking about building relationships, so that when they come back, they can tell that story. Even as we talk about domestic issues, as we talk about poverty, we talk about vulnerable communities, often, a number of us may or may not have those relationships, but how do we help people understand why a community a few blocks away may be experiencing the COVID-19 virus differently than the community that we live in? So helping people begin to build a vocabulary, begin to understand, and then to take that and, often I hear people say, be the voice for the voiceless, and I don't think it's that. It's like, how do we build partnerships with brothers and sisters that we want to advocate for, and to take their story to the Hill, to represent them, or work with them to go to the Hill together. And I think that's really having that understanding of what you were doing on Capitol Hill, but what does that mean now? And, and I think when we talk about government relations and lobbying versus advocacy, helping people understand how to be great advocates to the federal government when, when we talk about how our government is formed, for the people, by the people, what does that mean? So really giving people a real sense of, I'm going to say ownership, that this is their government, work together with their government officials to help build, a better union. And I think as you transition from one to the other, it's just remembering what you're trying to do. You may not have all the answers as you're advocating or trying to promote a policy, but begin to share those stories, share the data, help people understand why whatever policy or bill you're advocating on, why that will make a difference in a community. I think sometimes it's helping people see something that they may or may not be able to imagine. And the same with peace building. We were talking about a situation in Rwanda. Well, what mitigating things do we need to do? Help people see a vision that they may not imagine themselves, but help them build that imagination for themselves.
Would anybody else like to weigh in on that before we take a little shift here? If not, I'm thinking, and I'm looking at you right now, Winnie, though I know this is true for many of us, but one aspect of this kind of work is building coalitions and working with a variety of organizations and having those shift. And certainly CAP, because of the ideas you're promoting, that's a big part of what you do. I know Jenny, obviously, with the AJCU, the healthcare industry, you can go in any direction, but I thought maybe you'd like to talk about coalition building and how that works in this field.
Thanks, Scott. It is a necessity, I think, is the first thing I would say. I think it was Kim who talked about the grassroots. When I was at the Human Rights Campaign, just to say, Senator DeWine was always a target. He was always someone who we could talk to about HIV and AIDS issues or LGBT equality, and you needed to build a coalition. It was like one thing for me as a government relations expert to go in and meet with him. He'd be fine meeting with me, but it was better to have a coalition of people from Ohio. It was better to have a coalition of advocates whom he trusted. It was better to build a coalition of people who could actually connect with whomever it was that you were trying to move. And so coalitions are essential to the work that we do at the Center for American Progress. We are a multi-issue think tank. We have 20 different policy teams, from the economy to healthcare to immigration to national security to climate to women's issues, early childhood, the suite of education teams, working often with Jenny on higher ed issues, on and on. And each of them comes up with policy ideas. But having a Washington, D.C. think tank go into a congressional office or a governor's office or a mayor's office to pitch an idea about reducing the cost of higher education or a more effective climate policy or tax policy or healthcare can only get you so far. And so what gets you further, what gets you across the finish line often is the coalition that you bring in, the group of religious leaders who also can advocate for poverty reduction, the group of business leaders who you can bring in who can also advocate for climate policy. So coalitions and advocacy go hand in hand often with the work that I do on governmental relations that certainly happened when I worked at the Human Rights Campaign, but also occurs here at the Center for American Progress. And I think one of the things I've seen evolve, and I don't know whether others on the panel have seen this as well, is it used to be that these tools were more siloed. So you had your communications shop and you have your government affairs shop, and maybe you had a field staff who did coalition work, and you had press, and you had all of these sort of siloed entities. And I think in 2020, those functions are much more integrated, which I think leads to a more powerful, effective advocacy tool. So coalitions are now not thought of at the end, oh, let's figure out who should come to the conversation with a senator, but they're more thought of at the beginning as you try to move a legislator in a particular direction.
Else want to weigh in on that part of the conversation?
I might not talk about coalition as much, or sort of on a related note, what you find here and what you see examples of sitting around you. First, that Hoyas do love to help Hoyas. So I think you should all take our contact information, and anytime you're interested, you are going to be welcomed into our virtual offices now, but our offices someday. And we want to talk to you. We want to hear what you're interested in, and we want to help you along that path. And just, Georgetown helps you be the best person you can be. And that's a quality that you need in Washington, D.C. Washington, people will say it, sounds cliche, it is a big, small town. And the times that I've crossed paths on a friend level and on a work level with all these people around in these little boxes, I can't tell you how many times. And people who I've known or knew in the very beginning of my career have come back. And you want to be a trusted resource. You want to do your homework. You want that humility to say, if you don't know an answer to something, you'll find it out. When I was in the Senate, often people would say, oh, you're not like a Senate staffer because you admit when you don't know something. I was the queen of admitting when I didn't know something, and I would call Vermont because those were the people that knew. And I think of the times that I've worked with Lindsay on many things. Sometimes our bosses didn't agree, but we could work together and find solutions. And I trusted Lindsay, and I hope Lindsay trusted me. And that's the kind of thing that continues through your career. So I'd say that establishing that sort of credibility and that humility and the ability to be a good resource and answer the questions that need to be answered is critical as you move along your career path, wherever you land, whether it's on the Hill or in an administration or afterwards.
Yeah, and Scott is the perfect example of the LC that then one day, becomes your boss. It's like, that is how things go all over town. It's, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've made that jokes with other, you know, former coworkers that you really do. It is such a small town. There are so many people who are out there who want you to do well, who really want to share with you their knowledge. I, you know, benefited so many times. I worked for two great bosses on Capitol Hill. Both of them lost their re-elections. Both of them were really scary times. And, you know, and I was really lucky that I didn't end up having gaps in employment, because I was able to really, you know, tap into the contacts that I was lucky to make, that there are so many good people. You know, I think working on Capitol Hill too, there's so many people who, like Jenny said, will disagree with each other. But I think you really, what I felt anyway, working as a moderate Republican who was often sort of in the middle of things, is that at the end of the day, you know, people felt very strongly that what they were trying to do was the right thing. Of course, there are always going to be jerks in every, you know, area, but I think really for the most part, people come to work on Capitol Hill, certainly not for the paycheck. They're trying to do something that is really good and helpful for society, and they're trying to, you know, make the sausage that is legislation and make it something good. So I think that really translates, you know, onto your career as well, as people leave Capitol Hill and get other jobs, either they're, you know, booted out by the electorate or otherwise. You know, but I think there's always people around town who are still, you know, looking to do the right thing, who are trying to enact good policy, and are trying to help other people, and that includes in your job search. So I certainly wouldn't be afraid for any of you to try to make those connections, reach out. Don't feel like you're imposing. People are happier to talk to you than you would imagine.
That's right. And I found that true when I was at Georgetown and students wanted to go get jobs or internships on the Hill. And I'm sure some of you got calls from me. Would you talk to this student? They're trying to figure out what they want to do with their life. And people are very generous. I always say the older I get, the more flattered I am that somebody cares about what I think. I want to now take a question that Anshul Agrawal posed, and that is, do you have examples of experiences or skills that someone should highlight that would make their application stand out? And I'll start with a story of my own. When I was Dan Glickman's chief of staff, he became chairman of a subcommittee on the Judiciary Committee, and we were interviewing for a staff attorney to work on the subcommittee for Dan. And I bet we got almost 1,000 resumes for this job, and they're the field. And one of the questions I always ask when I'm interviewing people is, I said, you've looked at the job description, tell me what part of this job interests you the most. And usually you got a good conversation going. But one time, one of those lawyers who thought they wanted to come to the Hill answered that question, not by answering it, but instead telling me all of the things that he would not do in that office. He would not answer the phones. He would not go make copies. He would not turn on the coffee pot. And I'm sitting there going, are you really saying this to me? Like, I'm the chief of staff and I do all of those things. So, you know, get over it. And it was a very short interview. But anyway, to the flip of the question, and that is examples of skills or experiences that someone might want to talk up as they're applying for a job in government relations.
So, Scott, as you're saying that, I was thinking, gosh, what, you know, when you think about, especially since my career kind of pings all over the thing, but when I look at the job description or look at the announcement, or if somebody's talked to me about a position, I always try to tell them what I'm most passionate about. So, you know, one of the things they really wanted when I came into Catholic Charities USA was somebody who really wanted to work on hunger and nutrition. And I used to volunteer at an after-school program in DC that taught high school students how to cook. And of course, I was dealing with families that were also dealing with accessing SNAP and those sorts of things. So I just, you know, I highlighted that experience because then if somebody's asking me to talk about what food means in a family's life, but, you know, after a while, I think they're like, okay, we get it. You're really excited about it. But I mean, if you're really wanting to do something, whatever your true passions are, and I think that's when it truly shines through. I mean, you talked about what questions, what are you most interested in? When somebody starts talking about something they really want to do, I think that's when it's you know, those passions are really obvious and you really see that somebody really wants to make a difference or really wants to contribute. And I think you shouldn't be, I think as somebody said humility earlier, I think it's, yeah, this is who I am, but these are the things that are really important to me. This is how I can make a contribution in the office. And those experiences that contribute to that, even if you think they're minimal, they're maybe unpaid experience or a skill that you built up in the summer, which you thought by chance you had an opportunity to work at as a bank teller, but now you're looking at working on the banking committee. Well, what did you learn working in that bank? What did you learn about financial institutions? How do you share that information? I think it's really helping your future employer essentially learn how you think, learn how you approach an idea. And I think that's really, really important.
Very good point, Kim. And that's the kind of thing you can think through before you're going for an interview or you're putting together your cover letter to show that you had that passion. Jenny.
I was just going to add too, that I know, you know, Georgetown students are rock stars, and, you know, you're busy, and you, as we've heard from your colleagues on the panel, you do all kinds of amazing things while you're on campus. And I would just encourage you to emphasize what what you gain from each one of, even those, as Kim said, volunteer experiences or work experiences, and even find ways to translate. Like, I think of kids who coach at a swim team or something, and the interactions that you have to have with parents, the negotiations over getting paid and things like that are extraordinary skills. So sometimes to think a lot about those volunteer or different work experiences and elevate them, because I think you'd be surprised at how many of those skills you need in your first job, and how valued and appreciated they would be in an entry-level first kind of position that you might have.
I agree, and I think just connected to both of those really great comments, when I'm interviewing, and I have interviewed a lot of people, two things that I like to look for are initiative and judgment. And I think both Kim and Jenny have talked about that in their examples. Those are really important qualities. They're harder to teach. I think people have them or they don't. But if you can bring them out in a resume, if you can bring them out in a cover letter, if you can bring them out in an interview, I think as someone who wants to hire good people, those are two things for me: initiative and judgment. And the one thing I would just say, Scott, because you talked about getting 1,000 resumes in for jobs. I mean, one of the things I'm sure all of us confront is we have a lot of job seekers for the one or two jobs that we have open. And so obviously your resume, your cover letter, the interview, if you get one, has to stand out. But I also think, and this goes to networking and being creative, and the internet certainly helps in this way, finding a way to connect to someone in that office, senator's office, the organization you work for, who can say, hey, my brother's cousin is from this person's hometown, please take a look. My college roommate's son is best friends with this person, please take a look. And I'm not saying every time it's going to get you an interview or a callback, but it differentiates you from someone else. And it takes a little more work on your part to find the connection point. And clearly, if there's a Georgetown connection point, as you've heard from all of us, we are all in. But help the hiring person out by trying to make that connection. I know it's helped me incredibly as I look to decide who to interview and who not, because you get dozens and dozens of applications for particular jobs, in particular entry-level jobs. And so it helps me distinguish someone from another candidate.
I think maybe one piece I might add to this thread, Scott, going back to your comment, I can't agree with you more about just showing an open-mindedness to do anything and everything for whatever team it is you're willing to join. I think to Winnie's point, when you have hundreds or thousands of applicants, it's really easy to find reasons to weed people out. And I think when you start sensing that people may not be willing to sort of join the team and do anything and everything needed to achieve whatever objective that team is trying to get to, that's a pretty easy bar to knock people off. I think the other thing that I would also going back to my time at Georgetown, want to mention is, and this are related, sort of writing. And I think the ability to write clearly and effectively is something that I'm still struck to this day, how much I rely upon what I learned at Georgetown in day-to-day and just my writing. And I think related to that is attention to detail, to Winnie's point around cover letters. I can't emphasize also enough when you're talking about hundreds of applicants for a couple of roles, you sort of need to create some kind of criteria. And, unfortunately, even if the person may be the best candidate for a job, sloppy cover letter or mistakes all over a resume very quickly stand out. So those are a couple pieces that I would impart on folks as they're looking for new jobs.
Yeah, I agree with Joe. My first job on Capitol Hill, I worked for a senator where he very much valued brevity and large font. And so, and it had to be on one page. And so I think really being able to crystallize things down in a way that's very understandable for people who don't have a lot of time is a huge skill. Writing, I know we're sort of trained to write 50-page end of term papers or whatever, but that is not, so the work that you're going to be doing on Capitol Hill. They're expecting you to have done, a lot of background work for you to distill it down from them and to give them a recommendation. And that's certainly carried over as in all of my jobs, working with executives now. They expect the same thing. They expect conciseness, brevity, good punctuation, and they're going to trust you to be able to distill large quantities of information in a way that they can understand it quickly and can make a decision based on your recommendation. So writing is always, I agree, it's huge, huge, huge in everything that we do.
Right. And to Joe's point, also proof everything you send in. Whenever you do a resume or a cover letter, I mean, if you start seeing typos in a resume or a cover letter or grammatical errors, it's like, oh my gosh, do I want to go down this road?
And that's where you can come to the Career Center for. I got to interject. Even over the summer, we have drop-ins Monday, Wednesday, Friday over Zoom that you can just pop online, and that's perfect for reviewing cover letters and resumes. And that's what, we help with grammar checks, but we also help, with the brevity kind of thing and trying to take all your experience down and trying to get it on one page in a way that makes sense for the job that you're applying to. So everything everybody on the panel was talking about, we're here, we're not closed over the summer. So please definitely come see us and get those documents reviewed. So
that's great. Yeah. And I'd go back to Winnie's point too. If you know somebody who knows somebody, don't be shy about approaching them and say, could you put in a good word for me? If nothing else, it is likely to cause somebody to take another look at your application. It may not get you the job. It may not even get you an interview, but it does get you that second look. So I would encourage that. We do have another question. This is from Kenna Chick, a 2020 graduate. And she's wondering if you had any advice on how to best leverage my contacts in order to find a job as an LC, especially during COVID-19. And also, is there a better time to apply to Hill jobs given the election this year? Kenna, I think I know you through our mutual friend, Juan Martinez. So it's nice to have you with us. Want to take a stab at that? I'm very interested too. Obviously, I'm retired now, so I'm not going out figuring out how to look for a job, but I have to think it's challenging time to do that.
I was going to offer, even though things are closed in terms of physical space, I mean, I just had a meeting with 2 agricultural staff members this morning about SNAP. So it might take a little bit more work to get a meeting with somebody or to try to get, even a phone call, but staffers are working, they're taking, and I think in some ways they're a little bit, even as somebody who works on government relations, I'm finding it easier to get meetings because they can, what was incapable if you were running back to things going on the floor, they're able to set up phone calls and participate and do those sorts of things. So I would encourage you to reach out, but leverage who you know to see if you can figure out a time to do a Zoom call with them, to do a regular phone call. Don't let this period of time be discouraging. I would try to do the same sort of networking you would do. Just know that you're going to be doing a lot of it virtually, like we're doing this meeting today. And, I think this is where it's tough, but reach out to your friends. If, somebody's father worked with somebody else or whatever those connections are, don't hesitate. Or, and like Jenny's already said, reach out to us. If you find out through our profiles that we're connected to somebody or have worked in an office or know somebody in that office, or we're working on a particular issue that you're interested in, talk to us. And you may say, well, I'm really interested in working on healthcare from somebody from the West Coast who does this. Oh, have you talked to this office? I might say, let me connect you with the staffer that I know there. Again, it may or may not materialize, but it's really putting yourself out there and talking to as many people as possible and building those relationships and following up with them. Your initial conversation may not materialize in something, but let's say that election time comes and based on whatever changes happen in the House or Senate, they are now the chair of the committee. Now they're hiring committee staff. That changes the whole formulation that may have been different 6 months ago. So just, continue to think about it and continue to work. Even if you get discouraged, I will always offer you a cheer, just keep at it, because it's tough sometimes. It's really tough and it can be discouraging.
I agree. And Kenna, to that point too, I would say that as we've talked about, and I think Winnie was talking about that in that grassroots networking, we're Washington people, you're in Washington now, that limits a little bit who you can look to work for. But wherever you're from originally, whatever your home state is, whatever your district is, go there. That's a great place to go and start, even if for an informational interview. Just letting them know that you're in DC, you're from the district, you're from the state, you care a lot about your local community, and you'd love to help out if there's any opportunity. Sometimes that doesn't work depending on your politics. If you're represented by a Republican and you're a Democrat or vice versa, and that can be challenging, but look around those districts around you. And I think, again, I just would encourage you, they kind of work for you. So let them help you out right now.
Winnie.
Yeah, I was just going to add in terms of timing, and looking for a job now is definitely a challenge. Everything now is a challenge. So I think you've got to just sort of proceed ahead. Obviously, with an election coming up, a presidential election, where there will be a lot of turnover one way or the other, that both opens doors and closes doors. So I'm not saying wait until November, but I am saying that it would seem to me, I don't know whether others on the panel agree or disagree, that come the fall and into the election and coming out of it, there will be movement one way or the other. There will be people who retire. There will be people who are newly elected. There will be potentially a change in administration with opportunities there. So it certainly is right now sort of I think probably a time of stasis. Probably the people who have jobs are likely not to be leaving them right now with the economy so uncertain. So that's a challenge for someone looking for a job. It's not impossible, but I just think it's a challenge. It's going to be tough. But I do think that sort of the summer into the fall, there will be change and there will be lots of movement.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Winnie. And I think you heard us all talking about members of Congress for whom we worked, and we liked them. We agreed with them. Loyalty is an important aspect of working in a Hill office because you are called on to do a lot of different stuff. So I think you don't see a lot of movement unless somebody's retiring in offices right now. Also keep in mind that after the election, there is this initial period where everybody's trying to get their new members are getting their staffs together. If there's a new administration, all of that's going on. But particularly if there's a new administration, filling those positions stretches out over many months, and lots of people leave the Hill to go into an administration at the beginning. And so there's a shuffle that will take place over 8 or 9 months at a minimum, I would say. Now I have a question. I get often. Is it detrimental if I am a Democrat or Republican and I work the opposite party who is my representative or president? I just think that in most cases, it categorizes you. When it's on your resume, then it's, oh, you worked for a Democrat or you worked for a Republican. If you intern and you're interning for a home state member and it's different, I think you can explain that I just wanted the opportunity to be on the Hill. But I think you have to keep that in mind.
And
I'd say I work for a moderate Republican, and I don't, they're really, and so did Lindsay, like moderate, but they don't really exist anymore, but that allowed us some of the strongest relationships I had. Again, I got to work with Lindsay in her office. They were amazing. But some of the other strongest relationships that I have on a staff level were with the Democrats on our committee. And so I don't know that, I think you have to do research. There's probably a very small sliver of Democrats and Republicans that you can kind of get away with that, but there is still that small moderate group in the middle that sometimes allows you to have credibility on both sides.
I'd say that's true of appropriators too. Appropriators spend their lives figuring out how to work with people the other party to get things done.
And I have found that with some friends of mine that work on tax issues as well, particularly for moderate members, that some of them have been able to sort of go back and forth. But yeah, it's definitely rarer for sure. And the more sort of, if you work for one member who's like super zealous on his party, you know, then it's going to be really hard to probably go to the other party. But if it's a more moderate member, I think there's more receptivity to that. And I've seen it with people that I've worked with in my former offices as well.
So can you all talk a bit about how you see diversity and inclusion playing out in hiring, and are you seeing a change? I mean, obviously this is sort of an inflection point in the country that we're living through right now, but even before recent events, have you seen steps to more inclusive hiring? And is there advice you would give? I don't know who's on our call even, but if you happen to be someone who is of an ethnic minority, how things you might want to think about doing in approaching people.
I'll take that bait, not just because
Kim.
I look, but also just some of the work that I've been doing here at Catholic Charities USA and even at Catholic Relief Services was looking at kind of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And in terms of hiring, what I will say is, I think that a lot of organizations, and I'm sure a lot of people are doing a lot of self-reflection right now, but what that looks like in terms of leadership. But I think this is where research is really important in terms of how you will identify with the organization you sit in. I often, as I'm looking at jobs and applying, like look at the board, look at the leadership, and see what they're saying about those issues. And then as I want to introduce my opinion or my approach to those issues when it's been important and necessary, I think, again, speak honestly. I mean, I think if you've done the research, you know where that organization sits. And if you even kind of want to do a little pushing in that initial conversation, I think you want to be cautious. But I think if that's the direction you really think it needs to go, I say go for it. But then again, this is where networking is extremely important, to really get a sense of who you're going to be talking to, how they're going to approach the issue, and what the best strategy is. I mean, again, I think when we talk about the education we've all received at Georgetown, we know that we spent time researching and arguing. We've all learned how to argue both sides of an argument. When we look at this issue, that's really critical to how we form organizations, and those of us who really want to do policy that's going to make a difference in people's lives. I also think you have to, even when I'm, educating advocates and building their capacity to go on Capitol Hill, help, build your vocabulary up on this issue so that you're also using the right terms. Like if you're going to say diversity, you're going to say inclusion, you're going to say equity, you'll find that certain organizations may not even use the term diversity. They may talk about inclusion and equity. So what does that mean? And what does it mean to them? So I think be really clear about how an organization is approaching that and what it means to you, and so that you can be conversational about it. I don't think you should approach it if you don't have the background and you haven't done the research, because I think that's when you may present an opinion that really that will fall flat at an organization if you haven't really thought about what their approach is to that particular issue.
Well, we're getting close to wrapping up. We have about 10 to 15 minutes remaining. And if any of you on the line, students or alums who are on the line, have questions you haven't asked and would like to, please get them to Elizabeth so we can cover those. But I thought we might sort of wrap this up a bit by asking everybody who's on the panel if there are a couple of pieces of advice that you would like to offer, or stories from your own career. I love Kim talking about stories, and Winnie as well, and how important those are to life in this sphere. So you might have a story or two you might want to add as we wrap up. And maybe I'll start with you, Lindsay, since we started with you at the beginning.
Yeah, and this might be something that I've sort of talked a little bit about, but I think some of the nature of the work that we do, there is a certain amount of uncertainty to it, right? Especially when you're starting out in your career. It might be intimidating in some ways to go into this line of work. You know, I think every job sector that you're going to go into is going to have a certain level of volatility, but it's a different level, I think, when people are going to a voting booth. I sort of joked for probably too many years after my first boss lost his reelection. I think particularly taking it hard being from my home state as well, that the people of Ohio fired me. So I think that it's something that you have to sort of realize that there are going to be these sort of overwhelming ebbs and flows with politics in our country. And it makes it uncertain, but it also makes it really exciting. And it also makes it so that you're really at the forefront of so many cool issues, things that are really interesting, very timely, and really hard, right? I mean, the things that we're talking about right now are so hard, but they're so incredibly important. And what an honor, right? What a blessing that we're able to be involved in these careers, that we're able to do these things and you know, work for ourselves and for our kids and for generations to come on some of these issues that are so incredible. So I think, you know, for the class of 2020 who's going into this time of uncertainty, it's, you know, we all feel for you so deeply. Who could have imagined a 100-year pandemic? Who could imagine, you know, a recession like this? It's so incredibly difficult. But, you know, sort of as we were talking earlier about how to sort of figure out what the next steps are, I think Kenna had mentioned that in a question, you know, how do you get out there? I think, you know, sort of understanding and accepting also that, you know, I'm going to do my best. There are going to be limitations, but, you know, setting yourself up for, if you do want to be in this field of work, maybe it is going to be early next year, but using the time that you have now in a positive way to make those connections, to be take advantage of what Georgetown can offer you, is just so important. And I think, you know, maybe helps all of us have a better sense of feeling of control in a time that is really uncertain, but also so incredibly changing for the future.
Winnie.
I worked for the Office of Management and Budget, as I said, and I loved those 3 years as being a career budget examiner. But when I left to go work the Human Rights Campaign, and now at the Center for American Progress, my advice is find what you're passionate about and go do it. When I was a teacher, I was passionate about that. Even working for the Office of Management and Budget, I was passionate about that. That was like the best federal agency to work for. So I guess my advice is do what you love. Don't do what you think someone wants you to do. I sort of feel like life is too short to do that. And so I've worked for mission-driven organizations and been passionate about that. And I think Kim talked about passion, and Jenny did too. It's really, we're at work a lot of hours during the day. So it's good to be at a place that you feel passionate about intellectually and that you can be your whole self at. So that is one piece of advice. And then I think the second piece is, which may or may not contradict that, you don't have to be at a job that you don't like. Like, I'm all for you're finding the job or career that you love. But if you're at a job and you don't like it, I think it's okay to leave. Sort of this notion that you have to be there a year or you have to be there 2 years and you have to like sort of test it out. I guess I would leave you with a piece of advice that I don't think that's true. It's I think worse to be at a job that you're not happy at. I think you just don't do as good a job. So those are my two pieces of advice. And then the last is just use not just the Georgetown network that you may have, but use networks to connect to other people. As people have said, this is a small town. I guess the way I'd say it is, I think this is a one company town, sort of more like Los Angeles, which is certainly not small, but it is a one company town. And in many respects, DC is a one company town where if you're in the restaurant industry, it revolves around government. If you're in the entertainment or social media industry, you have a client who's in government. And so it's a one company town, and take advantage of that.
Thanks, Winnie. Kim, can I ask you to share some parting thoughts?
Sure. Actually, it's good that I'm following Winnie, because when she said don't be in a job that you don't like, and Jenny knows there were some of my jobs where I struggled at times, but the story that I want to share is, I mentioned that I'd spent some time documenting the genocide in Rwanda. I would still say, even though I've done a ton of other things, that's the hardest thing I've ever done. It was emotionally wrenching. It was taxing in every way possible. And yet I learned so much about myself. I learned so much about what I really valued. And so take those experiences and continue to learn, but also, especially now when it feels like, well, what do I do? Everything seems to be shut down. Be innovative. I was in a conversation with somebody who was kind of really struggling in the position she was in. It's a friend of mine. And I said, well, maybe this is the time to think about how things could be different. So as you're seeing, like, it is 100-year pandemic. It's, we're facing racism in this country in ways that we haven't talked about in a while. So what gifts and talents do you bring to bear, and how can you maybe do something different that could change some of these things and help us think differently about these things? I think don't be afraid to try something. This is the time to do it when you are young. When Wendy talked about going off and quitting her job and traveling the country, this is the time to do something you never thought you would do, and I would encourage you to do it.
Joe, how about you?
Sure. I think I'd agree with everything that's been said thus far. I think the other two things that I would impart on folks as they begin their job and career path is be strategic and be persistent. There is a lot of really smart people at Georgetown. There's a lot of really smart people everywhere, all going for many of the same roles. You will likely face rejection along the way, and sort of be okay with that and keep moving and plowing ahead, because if you allow those things to overwhelm or get you down, it's really difficult to sometimes, I think, pull out of that. And I think on the strategic front, I think, like everybody has been suggesting on the networking front, be really thoughtful as you sort of build out your web and your connection of networks as you begin to try to look for a job. I think one of the things that I always impart on young students and others who want to talk about career advice is, while I may, and I'm sure others on the panel hear about job openings, if you're not necessarily in active mode in seeking a job, you're not necessarily on top of every opening that may be out there and exist. And so I say that to suggest that as you're building out your network, be proactive, be in touch with the people that are part of your network and say, hey, I have applied for X, Y, and Z. Do you happen to know anybody in those roles? Because more often than not, I think you'll find success that way, as opposed to somebody coming to you and say, hey, here's a great role that I identified for you. So I think really being proactive and thoughtful and strategic in how you approach your job search will really pay dividends down the road.
Very good. And Jenny?
Wrapping up. So I would just say it's a long game, and you got to play the long game. So nothing happens fast often in our arenas, whether it's on the Hill or in our policy work, and you got to be patient, you got to be persistent, and you play the long game. I think when I worked on the Hill, I went to one bill signing, and it was the Higher Education Act of 1998, after toiling for like 6-8 years. I don't know how long it was, but that was the one bill that I saw signed into law. And you know, that's how a lot of this works. So whether you start as an LC, be patient, do the hard work, put in the time, and it changes and it gets better, and you learn something at every moment. So be open to learning, be patient, and play that long game.
I would just follow up on something you said earlier, Jenny, and you talked about doing informational interviews. I think that's an important thing to think about as you're reaching out. If you're saying, oh, I'm looking for a job, the answer can readily be, we don't have any openings, thanks a lot. If on the other hand, you say, I'm thinking I'd like to work on the Hill, or I would like to work in government relations, could I come or talk or Zoom or however you do it today and get some advice from you? I think people are very receptive to that. Lindsay had a point about uncertainty and these jobs, not knowing how long they're going to last. And I remember when I told my now late father that I was going to leave the Hill and go into the Clinton administration, and it was right in the midst of the impeachment process. And my dad said, why would you leave a secure job to go take a job for a president who's being impeached? And I said, Dad, I hate to tell you, but my entire career, I've never had a secure job. Anyway, it worked out, and I was at a lot of them a long time, but any of them could have changed. So you have to be able to live with uncertainty. And finally, for people who are looking, say, to get on the Hill for the first time, getting in the door is really important. And so sometimes you want to be in a place where you feel comfortable in terms of the policy perspectives and who you are, but you don't necessarily want to worry about your first job being your dream job. It's usually not. And getting in that door and starting is, I think, very important. So Elizabeth, I'm thinking you would probably like to do some, but let me first thank the panel. It's been a lot of fun for me. I'm glad I got to be a part of this.
Yeah, just wanted to echo what Scott said. Thank you all for joining us today, and students, thank you for joining us. We hope that we can do something like this again in the future, but I will be sending out after this the contact information for our panelists so that you can go ahead and reach out to them, you know, and, you know, start, if you haven't already, really start building that network. I've been in DC now for almost 15 years, and yeah, I agree. It is amazing how small of a town it is and how you keep on seeing people in the darndest of places. And yeah, how that network can really help you get those opportunities and learn about them, and also learn about what I think, Kim, you were talking a little bit about, you know, talking about diversity and inclusion, learning a little bit about what the inside game is like. You know, it's one thing for an organization to put out statements and say things, but then understanding too, you know, the cultures of different offices and different committees and the personalities and, you know, the things that don't make it on a job description. I've found that networking is essential to understand some of, I'll say, the little p politics that go on in the government relations world. So thank you again, everyone, for coming online, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. So Hoyas Axa. Take care.
Hoyas Axa. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye, friends.